Yes, sir. May I help you, sir?
Yes, I believe so. That is, I think I would like to purchase a cravat.
Oh, yes, sir. Have you looked at these on the counter? We have some really lovely ties. This one would go particularly well with the suit you're wearing.
It is nice, isn't it?
Yes, it ties very well, too. This material doesn't wrinkle or stretch either.
And it's green, too, my favorite color. But Carolyn's my wife. She doesn't like me to wear green ties.
Well, then how about this one? This one isn't green.
But it's rather, gaudy, isn't it?
Oh, no, sir. And it's from our latest shipment. Then here's another nice
Oh, but
one.
that one has dots in it, and Carolyn won't allow me to buy cravats with dots.
Well, what type of tie would suit her? I mean, you.
Oh, maybe you'd better just give me another one like the one I'm wearing, plain brown with no design. You see, Carolyn bought it, so I know it's all right.
It isn't hard to guess who's the ruling power in his family, but maybe someday the worm will turn. You know, these days we've come to look upon a change in ruling power as something to be more or less expected. But when King of the Jungle is mentioned, we automatically think in terms of the lion. Well, there's evidently been a palace revolution in those regions, too, at least so we judge from the proposed title of this excursion in science. For we'll be considering, our science reporter says, the reptilian aristocracy. We usually think of those who have the whip hand as being able to ride in the whirlwind and direct the storm. While at first glance it is rather difficult to imagine reptiles in that role, Emerson Markham will no doubt be able to justify to everyone's satisfaction the designation aristocracy as applied to them. Ladies and gentlemen, Emerson Markham, our science reporter.
Thank you, Bob Stone, and how do you do, everyone? If I am able to justify that title, Bob, it will be because of the facts I gained from a talk I had with Dr. Elbert C. Cole, head of the Department of Biology at Williams College. Dr. Cole has done extensive traveling throughout the United States, the Canal Zone, and the Mexican border, studying the reptiles, amphibia, and insects in these regions.
Well, now, let's get at the reptiles, Emerson. Do they come from a long line of aristocrats, or are they mere upstarts?
Well, according to Dr. Cole, Bob, reptiles are a proud and ancient race. Their lineage goes back to the time when the great coal deposits were laid down. Gradually, they populated the earth, assuming a dominance once held by their kinsmen, the amphibians. Rugged individualism was the accepted order of that day. A leader, an aristocrat, maintained his position by disarming or dismembering the opposition. Large and small, flesh-eater and vegetation-eater, diverse reptile forms appeared. Some trod the dry land, others wallowed in shallow water, others swam the deeps. Certain kinds developed powers of flight and, on their leathery wings, vied with their new kinsmen, the birds, for the mastery of the air.
You paint a revolting picture, Emerson. They must have been pretty queer-looking, though.
Yes, they must have been indeed. Some wore armor, too. Others boasted a more delicate skin. Generous girth became fashionable. Abruptly, at the close of the Mesozoic era, due to causes not fully known, these great forms perished from the face of the earth. Only a remnant of the former aristocracy remained. Leadership passed on to the mammals. Under mammalian domination, a few reptiles managed to survive, giving rise to our modern snakes, turtles, lizards, crocodiles, and alligators.
But in spite of the fact that reptiles had such a narrow escape from extinction in the Mesozoic era, they must have been a pretty tenacious bunch. We still have them.
Yes, these scattered survivors have clung to life. One is tempted to think of them holding their heads erect, proudly mindful of a glorious past. Aristocrats still, even though control is passed to another group.
You're waxing a bit poetic for my taste, Emerson. I'm afraid I prefer to consider them as loathsome inhabitants of an otherwise beautiful earth.
And you'll probably find many to agree with you, Bob. Nevertheless, from an objective point of view, modern reptiles are well worthy of consideration. I go along with Dr. Cole. He said he didn't recommend pensions or doles for these decadent aristocrats, but merely a place in the sun where all except the harmful and dangerous members of the aristocracy may continue to live out their age-long span.
Okay, how about getting down to cases with the reptiles?
Very glad to. Temperature sets definite limitation on reptiles in general. Since these animals have no device for maintaining a uniform body temperature level, they have met this defect by spending the colder portion of the year in hibernation. During this period of inactivity, the animals lie well below the frost line, practically motionless, with all bodily processes at a very low level. This adaptation permits reptiles to inhabit regions that would otherwise be closed to them.
They stand by waiting for the warmer weather when reptilian life is at its height, right?
Right. It is commonly believed that reptiles are able to endure a high degree of heat, but this has been definitely shown to be untrue.
How's that?
During the heat of the day, they remain in shaded regions, but are active during the early morning and late afternoon and early evening. In visiting snake dens in the southwest, Dr. Cole found that during the middle of the day there were no signs of snakes, but at sundown and for a time thereafter, rattlesnakes could be found coiled and waiting for the passage of rabbits and other rodents.
It's rather difficult for me to appreciate anyone's wanting to go visiting a snake den.
Well, of all the groups of the reptiles, the snakes are doubtless best known and most feared. In the northeastern area of the United States, that fear is justified only in the case of copperheads and rattlesnakes. They can be surely identified by the elliptical pupil and by a deep pit between the eye and the nostril.
Well, that's cold comfort to me, just the same. I consider half a mile as a minimum desirable distance from any snake.
But that fear shouldn't deter us from appreciating some of the remarkable structures and activities of this interesting group of animals, Bob.
Oh, quite right. What are some of their remarkable structures?
Well, first of all, serpents have an almost ideal locomotor apparatus. On the ventral surface are large scales pointing backward and overlapping like shingles on a roof. The combined action of muscles and ribs alternately elevates and depresses these scales, giving a backward thrust that results in forward locomotion. Practically unlimited writhing lateral movements of the body also aid in progression.
Emerson, how large a thing can a snake swallow?
The lower jaw of the snake is so hinged that any object that can be taken between the jaws can also be swallowed, Bob. The right and left halves of the lower jaw, covered with backward pointing teeth, are loosely attached. So when prey is taken into the mouth, the alternate backward and forward movements of the two halves give an effect of a ratchet and steadily draws the food into the throat. This process is facilitated by a liberal secretion of slippery mucus. After the food has been completely swallowed, the snake spends some time in readjusting its jaws as if seeking to acquire facial composure.
Not a picture I'd choose for my study. Let's get on to something else, as for instance, do snakes really shed their skins?
Yes, Bob, they do, and the shedding is a process of considerable interest. A new skin slowly forms beneath the old, and then the snake rubs the old skin free around the edges of the mouth and gradually extends this process backward until the entire skin, wrong side out, has been shed in a single piece. Even the surface of the eyeballs is shed.
That's a wee bit gruesome, but as you say, very interesting. How about rattlesnakes, Emerson? Do they do the same thing?
In the rattlesnake, there is a region near the tip of the tail from which the skin is not shed. Thus, at each shedding of the skin, a horny structure remains in loose contact with similar structures remaining from previous sheddings.
So that's what a rattler's rattles are.
Yes, Bob. These loosely interlocked remnants of horny skin form the so-called rattle.
There's another thing I'd like to know about. Fangs. How about them, Emerson?
Rattlesnakes and copperheads possess movable bones in the front part of the upper jaw, to which are attached paired hollow teeth, or fangs, connected with ducts from the poisoned glands, or the poison glands. When such a snake strikes, a complete series of events takes place in a very short time. Dr. Cole has a photograph taken at the instant that a timber rattler struck at its prey. The exposure time was 1/20th of a second, and yet the image was badly blurred. In an interval far less than 1/20th of a second, the snake had struck, opened its mouth, elevated its fangs, bit the prey, injected its venom, withdrawn its fangs, folded them flat, closed its mouth, and assumed its previous position. The perfect timing, the fine coordination, and great speed of this series of events is truly amazing.
I'll say. Dr. Cole certainly gets right next to snakes, doesn't he?
They're a very interesting subject for study, Bob. Dr. Cole says he holds no brief for the copperhead or the rattler, but for the black snakes, the milk snakes, the garter snakes, and for the diminutive green snake, red-bellied snake, and decay snake, some defense, he says, is valid. Collectively, the diet of these snakes consists of rats, mice, slugs, and injurious insects. After all, fundamentally, we have a problem of selecting associates. The choice lies between disease-carrying rats and mice, slimy slugs, and injurious insects on the one hand, and non-poisonous snakes on the other. Faced with this choice, humans may eventually give at least grudging consent to a place in the sun for the non-poisonous members of the ancient reptilian aristocracy.
Our thanks, Emerson, to you and to Dr. Cole for an unusual excursion. And ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to have a copy of a paper prepared especially for us by Dr. Albert C. Cole, head of the Department of Biology at Williams College, a paper which contains the story we've just brought you and other interesting facts besides, all you have to do to get your copy is address your request to Excursions in Science in care of the station to which you are now listening, asking for scientific paper number 220 entitled The Reptilian Aristocracy. That's The Reptilian Aristocracy, scientific paper number 220. Your copy will be put in the mail for you free of charge. And now, once again, it's time for our questions and answers. As you probably know, all the questions you'll hear have been sent in to us by you listeners, and the answers reflect the thinking of staff members of the General Electric Research Laboratory or members of other equally trustworthy institutions. Well, Emerson, here's the first one. Our friend writes, recently at night, I noticed the moon in front of my house on the east side. When I arose in the morning, I noticed the moon is a little in back of my house. Can this be the same moon that shines in Egypt and Palestine? And if so, how can it get there in such a short time?
Well, when it is full, the moon rises as the sun goes down. No doubt our listener made his observations at the time of the full moon. He says he first observed the moon in the east, so that it was apparently just rising. It was about 8 hours later that he again observed the moon in the opposite direction, that is, in the west, where it sets prior to the rising of the sun. The moon, like the sun, rises in the east and sets in the west. The reason for this is that the Earth turns from west to east, and this is what brings the sun and the moon into view.
And our friend asks if this is the same moon that shines in Egypt and how it can get there in such a short time.
Yes, it is the same moon, for it moves across the sky in the same fashion as the sun because, as we've already pointed out, of the rotation of the Earth. Now, the moon, we said, rises in the east where it was first observed by our friend. At that time, the moon was well across the sky in Egypt, and when our friend again observed the moon in the morning and in the western sky, the moon had disappeared from the sky in Egypt. That is, it had already set there. Since there is a number of hours difference in time between here and Egypt, the moon which we first see rising here has been in the Egyptian sky that many hours previously.
Next, we have this letter from a listener in St. Louis, Missouri, who asks, is the South Pole colder than the North Pole?
According to Dr. W.J. Humphreys, author of various meteorological books, the answer might well be that we have no records for the temperature of either for more than a few hours, and so that we really don't know.
Well, is that the only satisfaction we can give our questioner?
Well, no. Dr. Humphreys says that the answer can be reasoned from sure and simple premises. Normally, the greater the height, the lower the temperature, other things being equal. The South Pole is 10,000 feet, roughly, above, and the North Pole at sea level. So the South Pole would be expected to be colder than the North Pole because it is higher.
Well, that's easy to follow. Any other explanations?
Yes. The greater the height, the less, in general, the amount of cloud, water vapor, and other gas to radiate back to the Earth and thereby keep up its temperature. Now, as we just said, the South Pole is much higher than the North, and so we should expect the South Pole to have a lower temperature because it gets less return radiation than does the North Pole. And then, too, the faster heat is supplied by the surface to the lower air, the higher the temperature of that air, other things being equal. Now, by actual measurement, the ice over the Arctic Ocean gives off enough heat in 24 hours, coming from the relatively warm water below, to increase the temperature of a layer of air 450 feet thick by 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that given off by the South Pole or at the South Pole is only a small fraction of this amount. For all these reasons, the South Pole must be colder than the North.
And now we have a letter from a young man who writes, when you hold a flashlight underwater with a beam pointing toward the surface, light travels at a certain speed underwater and still another speed in air, as light reaches air from underwater, does it immediately assume its normal speed in air?
The speed of light changes instantly upon reaching the air from underwater. The speed of light in air or vacuum is approximately 229,000 kilometers per second. Its speed in water is approximately 225,000 kilometers per second.
Well, we'd better start making kilometers or something a second ourselves because our time is just about up. In fact, I have just enough left to say thank you, Emerson Markham, and goodbye, everyone, until our next excursion in science.